Welcome. And I want to tell you about broader picture of security as we see it, how WAM handles security internally so that you get a better feel of what we already provide. And then dive a little bit into WAM itself and how you're still able to do some insecure things in WAM and how to prevent that. So to begin, who here is familiar with the OWASP Top 10, which is okay. Let me give a brief introduction. OWASP Top 10 is basically a categorization of all the security threats that exist. It's called a top 10, but I believe these are the only 10 categories that they have. It's not, those categories are not very concrete security risk, but it's a broad category of security risks. When we think about security, it's important that you think about all these different aspects, because security is not just one thing. Security is a combination of a lot of aspects. And that of course involves the whole infrastructure in the production environment, the way you publish and deploy applications in the production environment, the way you handle backups, but also very application specific, the way you handle user credentials, the way you handle sessions, things like patch management, firewalls, the way you configure, for instance, TLS configurations where for secure connections. Those are all different aspects, and if you talk about security, it's important that it's clear about which aspect of the security you're talking. Most of these categories we already think about all the technical challenges to meet these security criteria. So if you are building a WAM application, you don't really have to think about the whole infrastructure and the internal rights management on the servers and the patch management and then the release management. That's something that we take care of. And if you're interested, I'd like to tell you a little bit about that later on. But from a security perspective, from an application perspective, there are a couple of things that you need to think about if you build a WAM application. The first one is the way you store user credentials. And for that, we already created the basic authentication project that I guess everyone is familiar with. And I was planning to go a little bit into that application to show you how we implement that in WAM itself. Well, other parts, of course, are things like checking that the user indeed has the valid rights or the rights required to perform an action. We have a pretty unique solution to solve that, and I'm coming back to that in a minute. But again, these 10 categories are very often used as to provide a broader picture of all the different aspects of security. If you are going to look a little bit more concretely to the security threats, This is a different organization. This is the common weakness enumeration. And they try to enumerate all the security challenges in a more technical manner. So here you see very concretely, for instance, the number one security threat is out-of-bound writes. And I'm not sure if that's something that rings a bell to any of you. This is something that you don't have to think about in WAM. And this is even something that we as developers don't really have to think about. This is specifically for the C programming language, where memory management is very weak. And if you find a vulnerability in software, you can, for instance, have a buffer overflow. I think that's something that you hear regularly, where you're actually corrupting the memory to be able to execute some code. Luckily, WAM itself is built on top of the .NET stack, and .NET is memory safe. So this whole security threat is not applicable for us. The second one is, and is even something that you sometimes need to think about in a WAM application, and I'm going to demonstrate that later on. The third one talks about SQL injection, and that's also a very common security threat where the user can try to hack SQL commands inside, for instance, a query string or inside a request to the server to try to execute some custom SQL commands on the server. This is something that you see. I saw this a lot in the early 2000s. If you went to a smallish website and you tried some things out in the query string, that it was very common that you could find SQL injection security vulnerabilities. Nowadays, it's not that common anymore because most SQL commands are now executed using parameters, and then it's virtually impossible to encounter SQL injection. WAM even goes a step further. Of course, as a WAM consultant, you never directly write SQL queries, and you just write a filter, and we have the software that translates this filter to a SQL expression. And this WAM expression, this WAM filter is even strong typed. So for instance, if you use a numeric field in this WAM expression, you are guaranteed that's always a numeric field and never a string, for instance. But this threat is coming back a little bit with API query languages. So for instance, if you use OData and you are building an OData query as a string, you are appending, for instance, some values in a query string, then because OData in itself is a complete query language, if you don't escape that in the right way, if you don't use URL encoding for that part in the URL, then you get basically the same vulnerabilities as before. So that's something to keep in mind. If you use the more generic REST APIs, OData is an example, but Graph query language is another example where this vulnerability can take place. But as you can see, there are a lot of them. Most of them are not directly applicable for WEM, but I still advise serious developers to at least take a look at this list so that you are at least a little bit aware of the vulnerabilities that exist. It's not always clear which vulnerabilities are applicable in which situation, but like I said, especially when you're integrating with other systems, then it's important to think about these kinds of things. And a third open database that I'd like to mention is the CVE database. This is even more concrete. This is a database with actual known issues for a lot of standard components. I can show that if I, for instance, why not, search on jQuery, then you get this big database of all the common threats and vulnerabilities that are found in jQuery, including the versions for which this applies. And this is something that we, of course, check often. This is something for components that we use. We check those components against this database. And sometimes we find a vulnerability, but then the next question is this vulnerability applicable for us? Because a lot of these vulnerabilities, luckily, are very specific. For instance, I can imagine that even for jQuery, some of these vulnerabilities are, for instance, only applicable if you combine it with, for instance, Magento or another framework. And then oftentimes it's because the other framework uses for instance, jQuery in an insecure manner.